You release a track and it sounds quiet compared to the pros on Spotify. Why is this? You understand that Spotify is going to adjust amplitude of different tracks in order to make them all sound within sort of the same loudness, but then why the heck do some tracks come across much stronger than others? And if you notice, certain tracks in louder genres such as metal or hardstyle sound quieter compared to a pop track, or compared to a more calming lo-fi hip-hop track. So why the heck is this, and what can we do in order to abuse the Spotify system and have our tracks be as loud as possible? Because louder to the ear does scientifically sound better and will drive more attention. Well, in order to understand how to do this, it makes sense to first understand why the heck we even care about loudness when it comes to Spotify, and why Spotify enacts all of its weirdness when it comes to loudness units full scale, or as we like to call them, LUFs. What happened in the olden days is for commercials, advertisers realized if they made their commercial a little bit louder than the competition, it would drive a little bit more attention. So everyone was competing upon having the loudest commercials. And even if your commercial reached 0 decibels on a mixer channel, there's still certain things you could do in order to make things sound louder in your commercial. For example, if I were to grab a random sound here, such as this vocal sample, you'll notice that in a mixer channel, it's going to peak at around -6 dB. But if I use something like distortion, I'm able to add other harmonics to it, and it now sounds a lot louder, even though it's still hitting 6 dB on the meter. So if we use things like distortion, or we adjust the overall dynamic range, or we add more harmonic content to things, either by adding different instruments, or again by, as I did here, using distortion or saturation, we're able to make things sound louder, which means that every year that there were commercials, audio engineers were finding creative ways in order to make their commercials sound louder than each other. And just looking at something peaking at -6 dB wouldn't have been able to communicate a standard to other advertisers to make things all within the same loudness. So instead, we created loudness units full scale, which takes into consideration the way our ears work in terms of perceiving loudness over time. So this means that when Spotify is going to get a track, it's not going to look at the average decibel level in your mixer channel and adjust accordingly to make sure everyone's average loudness is the same. It's instead going to make sure our average LUFs are the same with our competitors. And this is great because this is a more realistic standard to how our ears actually perceive loudness, which means if we were to try to do what was done in the loudness wars, where every commercial every year would get significantly louder than another, we would be able to turn down all those tracks, and even if they sounded louder, still make them all sound at the same volume based upon making their LUFs all equivalent to what Spotify does, which is -14 decibels. Now, this may sound complex. I'm going to get to the 80-20 rule, or sort of the 80% of the outcomes that come from 20% of the results of how you can make your tracks sound louder on Spotify. And it comes from just knowing that the adjustments that Spotify is going to make is based upon a long-term scale of how loud your track is. Meaning, if I were to have a track that is super loud and crushed into the red, into the limiter for the entire time, that track is going to get turned down more than a track that has greater dynamic range. So what I mean by this, and how we can get Spotify to either turn down our volume less, or hopefully turn up our volume compared to the tracks around us, is by doing something called automated dynamics. So let's look at Martin Garrix's track Animals for a second. If you look at the track, the way that it's structured in terms of its dynamics, and this is the master here that I have up, is that we have this build section where things get quieter and quieter and quieter, and at the drop, we're peaking way louder than the rest of the track. And if you see, the intro as well is a little bit quieter, and then again, build, we get to the quietest portion just so the drop seems louder on average compared to everything else that's going on in the track. And the reason why this is super significant is because what Spotify is going to do is take the average loudness of this track, which would be maybe this line here. Let me draw a straighter line for you. And it's going to make every other track equivalent to that loudness. Thus, if we have only a couple parts of our track that are extra loud, they're going to stick out compared to our competition. So if we were to look at how Martin Garrix probably did this, he most likely just had an automation clip such as this one that kind of got turned down on the build and then spiked on the drop. And because he has this real harsh kind of wall here, this was probably done within the threshold of the limiter. You can see this in a lot of other tracks. For example, here's a dubstep track by Vulcan called MF. And if I go to the actual track itself, you'll notice that the loudest sections, once again, are the drop, but he's specifically clipping everything and leaving all this extra headroom. So what Spotify is going to do is it's going to take all this extra headroom that's being used throughout these other parts of the track, and that's going to be used almost as a currency to make the drop extra loud in comparison with your competition on Spotify. Let me give you a very clear example. When people are producing dubstep, they want the track to be as loud as possible because the way the sound design is working, a louder bass drop is just going to sound more powerful and more aggressive on the ears. So we want our track to be as loud as humanly possible. I'm going to give you two choices of things we can do, and I'll let you guess which one's more powerful. One, we can do what Riot does here in AWA, where the entire track is just absolutely maxed out. We're clipping into the red, and there's very little dynamic range throughout the whole track. Or we can do what Vulcan does in his track MF here, where we have a lot more dynamic range, and we're just saving our loudest energy points for the drops. So quiz time for you. I've got two tracks up. We want these tracks to be as loud as possible coming through Spotify because we're in the genre dubstep where something that's louder is going to sound more aggressive. Which one of these do you think is going to sound louder on Spotify? The one that has all this headroom up until the drop, or this one down here that has pretty much everything maxed out into the red? The answer is the track up top, the one that has the extra headroom. And if you don't believe me, you can go to Spotify right now, play MF by Vulcan, or play AWA by Riot, and you'll notice that AWA is going to sound much quieter than MF. And the reason behind this is because we're taking loudness as an average over the entire track. So if we're then evening out those averages at the very end, having that extra headroom, if you're thinking about loudness as a currency, you're saving your currency to then have the loudest points be at the drop. And because AWA down here is going to be extremely loud the entire time, it means that we're going to have less of that leftover currency to really push drops harder. This is one of the reasons why you see so many artists when they release music on Spotify have their tracks sound quieter than their competition. They're not utilizing the power of headroom, which then later on can be used to drive dynamics further in the mix. This is why for Martin Garrix here, when he wrote Animals and did the mastering, we have this very clear amount of headroom and then also this deduction in volume for the build. Once again, you have some contrast, which will make the drops sound louder, but it also means that on Spotify, all of this extra empty space here is going to be equivalent to if we had AWA here turned down in terms of overall loudness, which then means at the drop, things are going to hit much louder than we would for AWA. The only other thing that's important to mention here when it comes to loudness in Spotify with our 80-20 rule is that doing anything in terms of albums is going to average the loudness throughout the entire album. This means if you were to have one track that was mastered a little bit louder than another track in the album, your listeners are going to hear that when listening through the album. This becomes a real problem even for professional artists. For example, Rebellion, who is huge in the hardstyle scene, has an album called Beyond the Horizon that's very well produced. However, their second track in the album sounds much, much quieter than the first track, meaning when I listen to it in my car on the way to work, I have to crank the volume up for the second song, and then when the third song comes in, I'm then turning the volume back down. And that's annoying for your listener to do, which is why Spotify tries to even things out, but if you have an album, Spotify won't. Spotify is going to average the loudness over the entire album itself. So that means when you're mastering an album, make sure that the max loudness between tracks is pretty standard or equivalent to whatever dynamic changes you want between the tracks, or you're going to have the same situation that they did, even as a professional. So in conclusion, if you want your music to sound as loud as possible over Spotify, you're going to need to use a little bit of headroom throughout the track in order to push the loudest parts louder than your competition. And what I think as well as a bonus that could be extra powerful is to make sure that your intro starts maybe a little bit louder. So when people are sampling your song and listening to just the beginning of it, yours sounds a little bit louder than theirs in comparison. And then when other producers are comparing your track to theirs, they start to wonder why their music doesn't sound as loud on Spotify compared to you. So that's my 80-20 rule, or the 80% of the results for 20% of the effort that you can do in terms of Spotify for loudness. There's some other things we can do in terms of compression and saturation that I was kind of hinting at before that I'll do a video on at some point. But for now, just understand if you want things to be loud on Spotify, you need to take advantage of headroom, just like Martin Garrix did here. So let me give you an example of how we would do this while mastering a real track. All right, here's my track taken away, and I have completely removed the mastering step where I make things quieter in the build, and I don't have a limiter on this track, which is why we have these crazy transients that you can see here. Let me play you a sample so you can see what we've created. Okay, you get the idea. What I'm gonna do first is I'm going to smack up this gain in my limiter to be pretty loud. So we're literally redlining, if you will, the track, where we're going to be clipping on purpose because this is dubstep and want things to be super loud. But what I'm gonna do is in the build, I'm gonna pull down this gain with a little automation clip so at the drop, things hit extra hard. And the way I'm gonna do that in FL Studio is just with a fruity balance. And you're able to do this in any DAW with just an audio gain automation. And I'm going to put this in here. And if we go into the actual build itself, I'm literally just going to copy the set point for the volume automation, which in this case is 0.8. And I'm going to start to decrease the volume on the build. And then at the drop, we're going to make things smack extra hard. This is going to allow us, when we do our limiting, to have pretty much the exact same look as what's going on in Martin Garrix's track here, or in Vulcan's track here, where we have these real quiet sections, which then smack real hard at the drop. So I hope this was not super duper confusing. You can get into a lot of, I guess, technical madness when it comes to mastering, and I'm trying to explain it to you in a way that gets you the biggest results for hopefully the least amount of effort. What I'm trying to get at in the end here is that loudness is going to be averaged over the entire track. So make sure you bring down the average loudness and have some dynamics so your track can be louder at those loudest sections compared to your competition, because you're using those quiet sections to basically pay for those louder sections later on. Hope this helps.